Hey, everybody. Ellie and I, we're back with you today to talk about voting. I know this is obviously a topic that is very much on the minds of pretty much everyone who's following politics right now. And today we want to think a little bit about the logic of voter turnout. And to do so, I want to first begin by going back to some of our rational choice explanations for political outcomes. And so we might think, first of all, if talking about this basic question of who votes, the formula that was conceived by famous political scientist Anthony Downs in the 1950s. This, of course, was a very complicated formula and one that we should talk about. I'm actually joking. It's an incredibly simple formula that has essentially just two terms on this side here. It's a simple formula that ultimately means this. V equals PB minus C tells us that voting, or the likelihood that you cast a ballot in an election, is a function of the probability of this B, which is deciding the election, that is receiving a benefit from actually tipping the election in your favor, minus the potential costs of voting. And so first, a word on this PB, right? Probability of benefit. Now, there's occasionally an election for a town council seat or an election for student body president or something at a small college where it may come down to a single vote. And there's actually a famous and possibly apocryphal example of a student body election at a small college where every single student had voted with a turnout rate of 99.9%, with the exception of a single student who was asleep in their dorm room. And so the members of the election board of the school came and knocked on the dorm room door of this girl and woke her up and said, "Hey, who are you voting for student body president? Your vote is the deciding vote." And so that person obviously had a very, very important responsibility to being able to cast that tie-breaking vote. But of course, in an election with millions of voters, that's extraordinarily unlikely to happen. It's PB. It's called PB essentially because we might imagine that if we were to prefer one candidate over the other, we would derive a benefit for having that candidate elected versus another candidate. And so the probability of obtaining the benefit through your action is quite literally the probability of casting the determining vote that swings the election in the favor of your favorite candidate. And of course, as we might imagine, that PB is incredibly small in any national election, any state election, even in many local elections. So the probability of deriving a benefit is tiny. However, if we think about what some of the costs associated with voting might be, we could think that this C term is actually non-negligible. It's actually quite large for a lot of people. Because even though we might be able to cast a ballot by mail, even though we might be able to vote early, even though we might be able to obtain fairly easily a number of different sources of information about the candidates and what they stand for, that still means time and effort, right? And anytime we've got time and effort associated with an activity, that's going to mean that this cost, even if it's small, even if it means going to vote and standing in line for 15 minutes, in a well-run and widely available polling place, that is still going to be bigger than PB. And so, as it turns out, Anthony Downs' famous formulation here is actually that for an individual, the likelihood that you actually go out and vote is essentially zero for everyone, because the costs are always going to outweigh the benefits. And so, from a pure rational perspective, no one should vote. It's a classic collective action problem. We've already talked about several of those in this class, right? This is yet another collective action problem from a rationality perspective. Why does it matter? Why does your specific vote matter? If you have better things to do, you may as well not turn out because you're not going to be that deciding vote. And especially when we layer on institutions like the Electoral College, right? It simply is not very useful. And so, of course, I'm being very, very pessimistic, very negative in this discussion. I don't mean to be. We'll see for just a moment some arguments as to why voting is nevertheless obviously incredibly important. I don't mean for you to take away this idea that I necessarily agree with the idea that voting is irrational. And so again, even though if we were to follow this Anthony Downs logic through this slide, we might also think about the fact that compared to other forms of political action, This seems to be irrational according to this logic, but it's actually among the easiest forms of political participation, which means that harder forms could actually be even less likely to occur in a large-scale electorate, given that the likelihood of deriving a benefit from those activities is just so vanishingly small. And so, again, if you're going to do something that's harder than voting, that's a political behavior, that means that you're going to have some resources to be able to, again, supply that sort of cost function. So, for example, like contributing to a political campaign. It could be an incredibly important form of participation, and as we've seen in some of our earlier discussions this year, it could be one that could have major impact on politics. But if we think about some of these other types of political behavior, this one is obviously extremely direct in terms of its cost. It costs money, right? There's other costs associated with participating as well, and that being things like contacting your representatives. That takes time and effort, and you need to become informed on issues in order to write them a letter. Maybe displaying yard signs and campaign memorabilia. You have to go through the effort of going and obtaining those, sometimes paying a small amount of money to be able to put those signs up. Persuading friends and relatives to vote the way that you'd like them to vote, that takes obviously a tremendous amount of effort. And in some cases, it's a lost cause, right? But that's going to take a lot of your time and energy. Even just following political news, right? You could be doing other stuff. You could be enjoying your Saturday morning and watching SpongeBob on TV instead of following the political news, and you'd probably be a lot happier for it too. Attending rallies, that actually is of course going to take time and effort, and there's a number of other additional unexpected costs in 2020 going out in public. For example, you might be vulnerable to disease, right? Knocking on doors, actually doing campaign activities, like volunteering for a campaign. Phone banking, text banking, doing all the stuff that campaigns do to try to activate and engage voters. And then, of course, the most costly form of political behavior of all, running for office, actually becoming a candidate and trying to go out there and run for a political office, even at the local level, is incredibly costly, not only in terms of your time, but also in terms of your financial resources and in terms of all sorts of other opportunity costs that present themselves if you're trying to win an election. So costs in terms of political behavior are always large and get even larger as we start moving up this chain and thinking about the really, really time and labor and money-intensive forms of political participation. Right? And so if we think about it, right, all of these forms of behavior have non-zero costs, and they, besides running for office, which may confer certain benefits, they have relatively diffuse benefits. So again, a classic sort of cost-benefit calculation from rational choice would predict that nobody should do any of these things. And yet, people do them. And people think it's really important to do them. And we should all do them. So what is going on here, right? Something else must be compelling people to go to the polls. And I say this is a hint for your writing assignments. This is maybe something to keep in mind in some of our future writing assignments where we're thinking about political behavior. Some other political scientists after Anthony Downs came along and they said, this could use some work. And they proposed an amendment, PB minus C plus D. They added this thing that we call the D term. Now, what the D term, we're about to find out. The D term classically stands for civic duty. And essentially, this is the idea that citizens, feel good, like they're fulfilling some sense of obligation to the country that they've been learning about ever since they, learned the Pledge of Allegiance or, had some kind of civic education in elementary school. And so again, even if some people don't understand almost anything about politics, like they're watching politics and it looks like cricket to them, they feel the sense of civic duty in their heart, and so they go out to vote because it feels good, it's socially desirable. And so again, this D term, it's not just civic duty today. Like we think about a wide variety of other psychological factors that are compelling people to participate. And again, if you think about this, you can even pause the slide and try to think of a list, right? What are some other psychological motivations beyond this kind of patriotic sense of civic duty that might compel people to turn out to vote? Why might they do this? Well, I think the answer here is ultimately that they're motivated by their communities. Right? They're motivated by their families, by their friends, by their political parties, right? People are trying to, impress upon them the importance of their decision, which will allow them to overcome that collective action problem and actually, collectively, together, have a major influence on elections. No one wins an election with one vote, right? But everyone wins elections when they're able to mobilize communities en masse to come out together to participate in the polls. And so if you can take that individual level cost benefit calculation and make it clear to people that overcoming that sort of irrationality will result in major gains for their entire communities, that's how people win. That's how sea changes happen in politics, and that's how ultimately change happens, right? But the costs are still there, and that's the thing that we should talk about now. This idea that a few different ways that we could decrease these costs could be, to make registration easier. For example, Congress in the 90s passed the motor voter law, which essentially allowed DMVs, or the Motor Vehicles Administration in each state, to sort of automatically register people to vote when they get a driver's license, or to at least ask them. We could make voting a national holiday. I think that, from my professional perspective, seems like an absolute no-brainer, and it's really a shame that Congress has not yet considered it. Vote by mail, obviously that's something that's rapidly evolving as people continue to build in safety measures due to COVID. I think we're going to see vote by mail become more of a standard in the future. Oregon, for example, has been using vote by mail since the 1980s to great effect, very securely. We could also, for example, help people to understand this civic duty idea. We could help to, increase essentially the D term by, sending people mailers, by trying to engage in some kind of pro-social, get out the vote kind of campaigns. Nevertheless, despite the fact that we've got these costs that we could try to reduce and some of these perceptions of the benefits that we could try to increase, some people might nevertheless still not be interested whatsoever in turning out to vote. And I think sometimes it seems crazy to think about this, that you probably know some people, and I know I've had conversations with students in Poly 100 already that have told me this, that in 2020, you have some friends who say, I have no interest in voting. And it might seem crazy to you. Like, how could you possibly not, be interested in expressing your voice in this election? There are still some people that don't want to do it. And so, some reasons for that might be that they sort of see through the veil of the Electoral College and they're being critical of that. Or maybe it could be that they believe that there's no one on the ballot that truly represents them. And so, however, that happens, we know that there are still going to be some people for which this cost-benefit calculation is going to result in a no turnout decision. So the D term is very important, but it is not the end-all be-all. It's not the panacea for gaps in voter enthusiasm. And so, another thing to think about is that it's possible that political campaigns could also play a role in spurring voter turnout, and certainly in your reading and in some subsequent module videos, you can think carefully about the way that persuasion might work to drum up get out the vote efforts, and how going inside sort of a campaign will really reveal to you, I think, the wide variety of different actions and activities that campaigns can take to stimulate voter turnout and to sort of change that D term for the partisans that belong to their political party. So I hope that this discussion of the Downesian spatial model the Downesian turnout model was helpful to you. And I really look forward to talking more about voting behavior with you, and certainly in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time. All right, hey everyone. One more note on voting behavior that I think will be useful to you as you think about this election in 2020 and beyond. So if we go back to the 1960s, we think about not just the question of voter turnout, but the question of predicting who it is that's actually going to win an election. And so going back to that time, in the 1960s, we had a number of researchers who were attempting to solve this so-called puzzle of minimal campaign effects, which is essentially to say that a lot of researchers were looking to see whether political ads would sway people one way or the other. And most of what they found seemed to suggest to them that political ads had pretty much no effect. And so Downs, remember we saw Downs last time in the PB minus C equation of turnout, said, hey, I can apply the rational choice calculus to this again. I can figure this out. And he says, essentially, well, the campaigns don't matter because people are judging the utility of voting for these different candidates on the basis of a wide variety of factors. And so he said, look, we've got two candidates, let's call it Mary and Jim. These candidates might provide different levels of sort of resources or satisfaction to this voter in office. And so Mary and Jim, essentially we can create a math problem to figure out whether that voter is going to choose Mary or Jim. And so that utility, again, this is sort of an economics term, which is essentially telling us about the overall kind of benefits that we might gain from having Mary in office or Jim in office. Right? If Mary's utility is greater than Jim, or if it's much greater, then we're absolutely going to turn out to vote for Mary. And so Downs says, again, it's simple, right? It's really just about this very simple comparison of the candidates. And so this comparison, right? This way of judging the two candidates in a holistic way, we can think about this from two perspectives. And the first one is that voters are engaging what we call prospective voting, which is to say that Mary and Jim are potentially going to pursue different policies when in office. And so we might be able to know something about Mary, and we might be able to know something about Jim, and we therefore make a prediction about the future performance of the country or of our locality on the basis of Mary and Jim's perceived issue positions and usefulness in office. So this means we know something about both candidates, and we can cast into the future some ideas about what would it be like if Mary won this election? What would it be like if Jim won this election? And so then we can make a judgment about our future utility on the basis of that prospective choice. And again, going back to this very nebulous, very vague concept of utility, really this is linked to this idea of performance, right? Because you're going to get more utility from a candidate that we think is going to perform better. And so whatever that means, it means a wide variety of things. So it could be that, for most people, performance issues, when we say a candidate is performing well, it might just simply mean valence issues. And by valence issues, I mean issues on which we can pretty much all agree. So things that, having more of one thing is generally considered to be good, having less of another thing is generally considered to be bad. And so the sort of archetype, the example of a valence issue is the economy. Most people, I would say, would generally want less unemployment. They would generally want higher GDP growth. They would generally want better, wage growth, those kinds of key economic indicators. And so if the economy is good, voters are generally pretty happy. And if the economy is crappy, then voters are generally unhappy. And so this is essentially a kind of performance voting that really just looks at some basic key indicators of economic reality. And so when the economy, if we think it's going to be strong, we support the incumbent. We say essentially, well, the incumbent's done a good job making sure the economy is strong, so we should keep the incumbent. When the economy is bad, if we perceive that the economy around us is in shambles, then we say, well, we got to go for somebody else because this person has been a poor economic manager. And of course, this famous kind of a line that comes from a political science book written in the 1980s, kick the rascal out, essentially. And the kick here is the key because it's really a knee-jerk kind of reaction. It's like a reflex. Voters reflexively vote against candidates that preside over bad economies. And so if we think about this again, this prospective kind of voting idea, we have to remember what kinds of information do we need to have in order to perform this prospective voting, even if it's on the basis of very visible and simple kinds of things like economic performance. Well, we need to know about Mary and Jim if we're in this election between the two candidates. And we need to know about how, say Mary's the incumbent, how Mary is going to perform in the future in terms of, taking care of the economy. But we also need to know about how Jim is going to take care of the economy. And if Jim is some sort of, dark horse candidate that came out of nowhere that has no record and no background, how could we possibly expect to make a judgment about Jim's future performance in office when we've never had any examples of how Jim might behave once obtaining that office? This is essentially just a big question mark. And so we might know about the incumbent and how they might perform in the future. We could make that projection, but it's much more complicated and it requires much more information to be able to make a good evaluation of the future performance of Jim. And so instead we might fall back on, again, a very knee-jerk, a very reflexive kind of voting behavior, which is what we call retrospective voting. And what this retrospective voting decision boils down to is an evaluation of past performance of the incumbent only. Essentially, we're able to see the visible incumbent politician doing stuff in office, performing their duties, attempting to take care of the economy, attempting to take care of other domestic social issues and valence issues. And if Mary's done a good job, we keep Mary in. If Mary's done a bad job, we kick Mary out without knowing anything about the challenger. And so again, even if we were to not even understand the name of the challenger before we walked into the ballot box, we'd be able to say, look, if Mary is good enough at managing the things that I care about, if her performance in office was good enough, I don't need to know about the challenger. The challenger can't possibly be better. But if Mary did a really, really bad job, we might say, well, I don't need to know anything about the challenger. They might be a total, nutcase, but, we can't get much worse than Mary, so we might as well go for some other option. And so if you think about it, right, if you're thinking in your head, this seems like a very dangerous kind of vote decision because we don't know anything about this challenger and they could, again, be a very bad candidate. You'd be right. This is a potentially shaky kind of voting decision. However, I would argue that a large number of Americans engage in voting behavior that very much looks like this retrospective kind of idea. Many Americans are very much judging the performance of the incumbent with very little knowledge of challengers, especially at the local level, and making knee-jerk, reflexive reactions when choosing to vote. So again, right, these are citizens who are generally falling victim to that same rational ignorance argument that we talked about in a previous module. However, right, this is, I think, where we get into some important conceptual territory here that goes way back to this original discussion of Dahl and enlightened understanding. Is it good enough that citizens are able to perform this retrospective vote and kick out rascals, essentially, whenever they arise? Or do we think that voters need to know more to be able to have better decision-making capabilities when they go to the ballot box? And so again, this may help to salvage some democratic theories. This may help to get Dahl to say, okay, well, at very least, if somebody's doing a really bad job, we know that we can rely on people to essentially kick them out. However, asking them to go much further than that and to evaluate different policies and to really, think about in depth about a lot of the stuff that will ultimately affect the direction of the country, that's maybe asking too much. It might be satisfying to us. It might make us feel good in our hearts to know that voters are able to do the bare minimum, but it may also leave us grasping for more as well. So I leave you with that kind of dilemma in this video. I think that this is a very important discussion and certainly one that we want to pick up in next week's in-person discussion. So have a wonderful week, and again, I'll talk to you next time.